side, wanna watch the world passing by. With you by my side, maybe this ride can make things right. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape. Let's go nowhere. Gotta wish tonight, baby, please set your thoughts aside. 'Cause it's been so long, maybe we could drive into the dawn. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape. Let's go nowhere. We could go nowhere. Got nothing inside, wanna watch the world passing by. With you by my side, maybe this ride can make things right. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere. Give me more hours of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to escape. Let's go nowhere. Gotta wish tonight, baby, please set your thoughts aside. 'Cause it's been so long, maybe we could drive into the dawn. Speeding up, blurring out the lights. Soon your eyes will be the only blue. Give me more minutes of this peace. We could go anywhere. This is our chance to forget. We could go nowhere.
All right. Welcome everybody to this webinar on business as a force for good. I'm thrilled to welcome Roberta and David to this webinar. I'm going to introduce you briefly in a minute, and then you can introduce yourself afterwards. But first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Pernille Hibbe-Brun, and I'm the CEO and founder of the company Session. And to those of you who do not know what Session is all about, we are a global online coaching company, and you can check us out on getsession.com and on the social media channels if you like. So I'm thrilled to see this many people joining, and like always, you can say hi in the chat, and you can post any questions you might have, and we will try to see how many questions we can cover during this session. So let's dig in. This topic of business as a force for good, why do we even need to talk about this topic? Well, basically because the world needs it, right? So we have a climate crisis going on, we have social unrest, we have people suffering of inequality and inclusion issues, and all these different issues are worth paying attention to, but they are also worth finding solutions for. And that's why we have this webinar. And Roberta Baskin is joining us with the voice of not only journalism, but also running different initiatives and supporting initiatives all over the world, showcasing businesses telling a different story, how they help in the world. And the first time I met you, Roberta, that was back in 2016 at the fourth global, I think 15 actually, the fourth global forum on business as an agent for world benefit.
Yes.
I think you were showcasing the Aim to Flourish initiative, and we were building it up. And to those of you who do,
we were co-creating it.
We're co-creating it, and the initiative is basically teaching business students to make interviews with their leaders and businesses who are doing and making a real difference in the world. And that
actually, we used the Sustainable Development Goals even before the UN officially voted on them, before 193 member countries unanimously said, yes, this is what has to happen by 2030.
Exactly.
We realized this is what has to happen. This is like the to-do list for the world. And these students, since then, Pernilla, have written more than 3,500 stories about businesses that are in some way helping to achieve one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals in more than 100 countries. So
there you go.
I'm just so excited about, how this thing Aim to Flourish has flourished.
Exactly. And David, I first met you back in 2005 when I took my first deep dive into appreciative inquiry. And that has, to be honest, changed the way I work and changed the way people work in so many different industries all over the world. And I'm thrilled to be here with you today, David, and very honored that we got to co-author the book, Strengths-Based Leadership Handbook, back in 2016. That was published through Crown Custom Publishers. And now you've written a new book. And that book, I'm so excited to hear more about your findings when you interviewed leaders for the book, or showcasing businesses doing great, and also what else you're up to these days and what you're working on, and hearing more about your upcoming conference. So that's all very exciting. And on the topic of business as a force for good, let me first ask both of you, why are you occupied with this?
Well, I have to add that I also took appreciative inquiry from David. And as a former, I would say, a recovering investigative reporter, the work that I did for more than 30 years was looking at corporate misconduct. I really was excited to tell you about a company doing a bad thing. And doing a deep dive into David's work with appreciative inquiry really, my synapses reconnected in new ways. And I started marinating on the idea that, I think, instead of telling people what's wrong in the world, what about finding ways to tell them about what's right, where the solutions are, who's doing it right? And those are the companies that you want to support. And so I think I'm the only person in the world who has taken appreciative inquiry from David twice. David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I did. I was in the first certification class, and then I think maybe 9 years later, I felt like I needed a tune-up, that I was slipping into my old bad habits of, problem solving instead of, really seeking solutions, focusing on solutions, which is what Aim to Flourish is about.
Yeah, so it might be human nature to slip back into the old habits if we do not refresh ourselves.
I have to speak for myself that that's what happened with me, but it really has changed my life also.
Yes.
It's really made me think differently, and including not just in terms of my work, but even in raising my children. Instead of yelling at them about, something that they've done that's wrong, saying, "Oh, that looks good over there." How do we get more of that little spot in your room that looks so neat and clean? What happened over there, and how can we build? It's just it's a valuable tool set that changes the lives of those who discover it.
So David, what's the story behind all this? Why did you all of a sudden figure out that you needed to help businesses do good in the world?
Yeah. Well, I'll just share a little background, but first of all, just gratitude to you, Pernilla and Roberta. It really is an important time, and I was telling Pernilla, my daughter and her husband live in Denmark, and they're getting ready to have their second child. And Hugo, the first one, is about 1.5 years old, and so the new one is coming. And as a grandfather, I spend a lot of time thinking about the future that we're going to be handing to our children. So I'm proud and excited about the work we've been doing. I'm the faculty chair of the Fowler Center for the Study of Business as an Agent of World Benefit, and it's not an assertion; it's a real question. Business as a force for peace in high conflict zones. Business as a force for eradicating extreme poverty. Business as a force for partaking in this massive global transition moment that we're in. And so it's a question: what does it look like? Where is it happening? And so on. The other part that I like to bring to this is the whole human sciences have just been shifting in a dramatic way that affect the way we do practice. And we'll get into this, I think, a little bit about how do you do it with these companies that are really moving into more than sustainability. We're going into a sustainability plus kind of world where net positive is the destination. So we'll get into some of that, but again, the literature in that area that helps us begin to think about how to bring human systems together to enact this is so exciting. The positive psychology of human strengths, and the whole study of, not just depression, but flourishing. What are those conditions that create that? So I honestly believe that today needs to be the decisive moment that we make the business of building a better world, the growth story of our time. And we are entering into the next episode of Business and Society, the whole next new story of putting nature, people, planet at the heart of global value creation. Yesterday, I just interviewed Jesper Broden, the head of IKEA, and Hala Tamsador, the head of the B team, and we can talk some about this. But I think we are at a historic turning point. It's taken longer than I thought it would. I'll share a little bit about how we got into this, but I think it's taken longer. But now I think we are moving into a tipping point moment.
We are in a tipping point, David. I mean, I'm fairly obsessed with the climate crisis now, which I actually, when I worked with Bill Moyers, I covered the COP9 in Milan back in 2003. And we just haven't made enough progress. And I look at the Sustainable Development Goals, they're 17 goals about what needs to happen in the world by 2030. And in many ways, well, they're all integrated. I think that the number 13 is dealing with the climate crisis, but the work that business can do in terms of showcasing what they are doing on behalf of making a more sustainable world is more important than ever. It's really also had a life-altering impact on just my personal habits in terms of driving an electric car and putting solar panels on my house. But it's not just individually, it has to be business, it has to be government, it has to be policymakers, educators, in terms of, we have this beautiful window of opportunity. We know what the solutions are, and we can do it if we move fast and with urgency. I think about David Orr's quote that I love so much about hope, that hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So I'm keeping my sleeves rolled up in terms of this. This is the decade when it needs to happen.
Yes, and you mentioned the word sustainability, and David, you mentioned it too, but you said we need to think beyond sustainability to look at how we can create maybe flourishing communities. And I remember you mentioned once that, well, who would want to live in a sustainable marriage? That's not how we look at it, right? It needs to be more than just live in a sustainable world. We need a thriving world. And maybe, David, can you put some more words to that? What is it actually you mean?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're using the term full spectrum flourishing. And you're right. I think I'll share a little bit about the decades here, as the 21st century started. And then the second decade with the 2020s. But where I'll end up is this idea of full spectrum flourishing, that the destination or the North Star that I'm hearing from these business leaders is a world where economies and businesses can excel, a world where all human beings can thrive, and a world where nature can flourish, not just for the moment, but across the generations. And that's what we really want. We need to be talking about what we want. And so often sustainability is about less, less harm, less CO2, less. And you can only go so far with the less. And what we're moving into is an era of regeneration. How do we develop and renew the lungs of the planet in terms of the Amazon? How do we clean and take out the toxicities and build waterways and so on that can regenerate themselves? So I think everything is moving in that direction. Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston just have a new book coming out any day now, and it's all about net positive. And Paul, as everybody knows, he was the head of Unilever. The decade that he led was just an incredible decade. They adopted, as Roberta talked about, the Sustainable Development Goals. They adopted the Sustainable Development Goals not as an add-on or as a kind of a social responsibility, but as the core of how they build strategy and product, strategy and geography, strategy and eradicating extreme poverty through their work and so on. So I do think that we are moving into, let's just call it a sustainability plus or full spectrum flourishing world. And we can share a lot of examples about that.
Well, more than 3,500 on the Aim to Flourish website. And Paul Pullman actually was one of the presenters. I think it was the first year because we give out 17 Flourish prizes each year. And we have these sort of secret presenters, and Paul Pullman was one of them. We've had some amazing, Ariana Huffington. It's always a secret in terms of who pops up and gives out the Flourish Prize. But it's been really amazing to see the growth of it and the love. Talk about sustainability. It operates on love, not money, really, because professors like using it and business school students like getting out of the classroom to do the research and find an executive, an innovator, a business leader who is doing something positive for the world, helping to achieve one of the global goals, and often becomes a mentor for that student. So it's just joyful.
So the critical mind might ask, yeah, but that sounds all like wonderful, and we all want to dream and imagine the next new, but the brutal facts are there, right? And what's your take on that, and how can we help make that shift? And maybe, David, you can tell a little bit more about your approach to actually helping people make that shift, and how it matters to also face the brutal facts.
Yeah. Well, my passion in terms of the applied work is working with whole systems. When I work with leaders, it doesn't matter what fields, on what disciplines, government, nonprofit, communities. They're, obviously in this VUCA world, and so it's all about change, and it's very, very challenging. But recently, their questions about change have shifted, and the real question isn't just about change per se, but it's about change at the scale of the whole. How do we move together as a whole 67,000 person telecommunications corporation around some big dramatic paradigm shift? How do we move together as a whole economic region that maybe is in transition, has been depressed? How do we move a whole 1.5 million person city together? And to illustrate that a little bit, we do planning, for example, in groups of 500 to 1,000, and now with the Zoom technologies, even more. But one that pertains to this topic area, and it gives a little illustration, I think, of the shifts from decade to decade once we entered the 21st century. So this is how I got my feet wet. This was the story Kofi Annan called our center, our school. He wanted to host the largest meeting in history to really, as he put it, to unite the strengths of markets with the power of universal ideals, to unite the strengths of markets to deal with, the complete eradication of extreme poverty and the climate issues. And it became the largest meeting in history between CEOs and the United Nations. And it was controversial. That happened in 2004. We were invited to design that meeting with Appreciative Inquiry. And so it was, first of all, it was kind of a shift for the United Nations to, most world summits are talking heads and pre-negotiated agreements and, just about anything except collaborative co-creation. So it was fun. He asked, how are we going to get started? And he said, we'll have the CEO of Pfizer turn to the CEO of Novo Nordisk and do an appreciative interview, but surface the stories of where business is going to be in the future, and the stories of the true, the good, the better, the possible that was emerging. And it was so exciting. We filled the room with 2,000 stories, and the conviction, you could just feel it. But, for me, that was my first getting my feet wet to see how serious the CEOs were being about this. And then fast forward, at that time, there were about 500 corporations part of that effort. 3 years later, there were over 1,500 of the world's largest corporations. The next meeting happened in Switzerland. And again, my sense of hope started growing, as you're sitting with tremendous people like Jeffrey Sachs at the table. And he had, he's documented how we can be the first generation in all of human history to completely eradicate extreme poverty, the grinding poverty that you and I can scarcely identify with. And he's pounding the table. He sounded like John F. Kennedy. And then Jane Nelson from Harvard, she heads up the Kennedy Center for Leadership. And she's talking about all the the solar revolution and the energy and the technologies we're going to see in our lifetimes. And, studies at University of Venice of spraying solar cells onto windows, and every building can become a power source in a decentralized way. And, so the stories, and Ratan Tata talking about the Human Development Index and the impact that, how they identify and create their strategic goals in relationship to nation building and lifting people out of poverty and so on. So that was really exciting. And today, that organization, that UN Global Compact, has now 14,000 of the world's largest corporations. But I do have to say, from the 2004 to, let's say, 2020 and 2021, I felt like the world at large was sleepwalking, and Roberta mentioned, as the 2020 started, what did we enter, in January of the 2020 start of that decade, we had climate and mega fires and mega floods and waves of catastrophe.
That was predicted 50 years ago. I mean, the timing is right on schedule. We are in this climate emergency now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm heartened by is that the media, which has been asleep in terms of covering it appropriately, because they have a hard time with covering sort of an existential threat. I mean, how do it was always like thought of as something in the future, and we'll get to it, when it becomes breaking news, which it is now. But there is an effort called Covering Climate Now, which was started by The Guardian and the Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation, and it's become a movement. There's 460 news and media partners that have signed on to their climate emergency statement in 57 countries, basically saying we're going to produce more informed and urgent climate stories, that we're going to make it a part of all the newsroom beats. And I think that's really important in terms of information and the power of information. Plus, people are just seeing it around them in their daily lives now.
Yeah.
In fact, Bill Moyers had an amazing idea that he shared in 2019, and I'm just starting to see it now, which is that weathermen, which are a trusted news source, bring your umbrella tomorrow, but now they're taking the weather and putting it in the context of what's happening with the climate.
Yeah.
And the words, we all say words create worlds. In part of what Covering Climate Now has done as a movement, The Guardian changed its style guide from saying climate change, which sounds like spring is coming, to climate emergency or climate crisis, just to grab people by the lapels and just say, this is happening now.
Yeah. No, and that's so important. So this acceleration we see happening, I think it needs some, further clarification in terms of just how important this is. I was, on a phone call with Muhammad Yunus, and he called this, the decade of last chance. And it just pierced my heart, to really, if you take that in and let that sink in, that just means that, in terms of the challenge of keeping the planet and the IPC, the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees centigrade, to keep at that level, we cannot squander another decade. And we have been sleepwalking for, at least, like Roberta said, 4 decades or something. So I think that's part of what we're entering into. And, Larry,
that's encouraging too, David. It's like, it's the opportunity. It's like now or never. And so I think I really do have a stubborn hopefulness about it, that people are paying attention now. I really see it with young people. I have a daughter who's become a vegan because of climate, and who shames me for any food waste and points out packaging and transportation costs in my buying. So, shopping our values is something that I see, very clearly with young people. And some of them are pretty angry also in terms of how selfish we have been, we older folks, in terms of, cutting down trees and eating too much meat and burning too much fossil fuels. But we know what the solutions are. And so we have this incredible opportunity right now to make the sacrifices so that our children have a world to live in.
Yeah.
And I'm just pulling up this quote from the Deloitte Millennial Survey, right, where 4 in 10 think that many large businesses support charities or social initiatives for their reputation instead of genuine desire to do good. So how do we teach business leaders and businesses to convince all of us, and not only convince, but actually make real change in the world? What is it that we need to do, and what's the solutions there?
Well, another organization that I would add that not many people know about is called CECP, which was started by Paul Newman back in 1999, and it stands for Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy. And these are CEOs that are, thinking about how can they give back to their communities. Also, the B Corp movement makes my heart happy. I mean, it's really taken off. In fact, Bart Houlihan, who's one of the co-founders of the B Corp movement, was in our session when we designed Aim to Flourish. And it's basically, looking at more than shareholders. It's looking at what are you doing for the community? What kind of, how do you treat your employees? What does your board look like in terms of reflecting humanity? It's, how much transparency, accountability. It's a whole different way for corporations to think in terms of not just their shareholders, but their stakeholders of every kind. Yeah. And I look for B Corps in terms of, shopping my values. I mean, I look for companies that are B Corps because I would rather make that choice over a company that isn't one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in relationship to these kinds of trends now, they're not trends anymore. They're trajectories. They're unstoppable, I think. And, if you look at the business news headlines, just, 2 weeks ago, green investments to reach 50 trillion by 2025. The environmental ESG linked funds see a 10x rise since 2015. Headlines from Mark Jacobson at Stanford. He's got plans now for 138 countries, how they can be 100% renewable energy. So, and 200 organizations from Apple and Orsted to Estee Lauder, Salesforce, Patagonia. They're part of what's called Renewable Energy 100. So, think of how important this is in terms of once in a civilization type transformations at a big level. I mean, we are going to see, within our lifetimes, it's going to be unstoppable.
I love that you mentioned Patagonia, David, because I'm thinking also about marketing and companies marketing the truth. Really. And Patagonia's show-stopping ad, full-page ad in the New York Times that said, "Don't buy this jacket." Right. Remember that? Yeah. And with Patagonia, you can, I have a friend who bought a Patagonia jacket at a thrift shop, and it had a pocket that was that needed to be sewn, and sent it in, and Patagonia fixes it. I mean, and Eileen Fisher also does that sort of, they'll fix, fast fashion is another big issue in terms of how we shop. I mean, that's the other thing with my daughter, who is so concerned about the climate crisis. She shops online at Goodwill, which I shouldn't say because nobody knows that Goodwill is online, but yeah, she gets great bargains there. I mean, there's a lot that we can do, and that I think that young people really are doing. I mean, they get that that the planet that we are leaving them is unfair for them. And the planet will be here because Mother Earth knows how to regenerate and knows how to flourish, but humanity will not be here if we don't get our act together fast.
Yeah, and to reinforce this movement, There's a macroeconomist, he's passed away, but Rudy Dornbush, and they call it the Dornbush law. And he said, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. And I think this is the era where business for good is good business. I think, yes, it's a critical decade, but I see it happening. And one way I'm making sense of it is I don't know if you know The Economist. She's just a up and coming, amazing economist, Mariana Mazzucato, out of Italy. And she's got several volumes on what she has studied as mission economies. That's what she calls it, mission economies. Not a high purpose company, but whole economies that take on a purpose. And she studied about 150 of these kind of mission economies in over 100 countries. One that is kind of a classic case in her studies was, the moonshot and John F. Kennedy calling for us to really come together to accomplish something. And what she shows in her economic dynamism models is that this is when the economies are most dynamic, most innovative, and most high purpose in terms of helping produce, forward movement. And so she didn't say this, but I started thinking about how the SDGs now are moving to a point where, and the Paris Agreement and the numbers of companies and investors and the capital movement, that I think we're moving into the world's first mission economy. We've had these mission economies that not at this kind of level, but you can say, when you look at humanity coming together to do things like the global eradication of smallpox, well, that was a huge achievement. But I think this mission economy that's being born right now just, makes the smallpox eradication pale in significance. The Marshall Plan was a time where we came together to rebuild and so on. But again, that pales in significance to all of this.
Right. It does take the world in terms of solving the climate crisis. It's not a country or 10 countries that can do it.
Yeah.
And it's the countries like the United States and China that are, this is time to put politics aside in service to humanity. And I think of competition and the sort of competition of boundaries in the world and politics. That is the old paradigm that needs to be buried. That we need more collaboration.
Yeah, maybe we can start competing on that, right? On doing good. So David, when you've done your latest interviews with business leaders, what have you found? Has anything changed? Are they doing something new, something that we haven't heard about before? Or is it building on the same shift that we've seen also when you had the UN summit back in 2004? Or has something new happened?
Yeah, something new has happened in a big way, besides just the movement beyond sustainability to net positive. And I think there's, in our studies, I'd say there's two different dimensions of leadership that have emerged here. And one is just something that's not being taught in any kind of business school at all, but it's happening, and it's happening in a big time way. I think what we saw in all the interviews and studies is that there's kind of an area that many of us know about now, and it's about stakeholder value. It's about shared value, the shared value strategy, and throughout the enterprise, then you start shaping the enterprise, around net positive products, around, you develop new blue ocean markets and so on. So you've got the inside of the corporation, but the new one that's emerging is business leadership outside of the building. So Rosabeth Cantor has written a book about, how all of value now is being created outside of the building. And we've tracked like 5 different ways that businesses are doing this outside of the building work. So you've got the traditional sustainability, building the sustainable enterprise culture, putting it into the DNA, putting it into operations, putting it into everything in, strategy and products and transparency and so on the inside. But it's the outside that's most intriguing, where businesses are not so much like, let's say I'm an organization development person, businesses are not so much the clients of change anymore, but they are the change agents themselves. So put that mindset on that. We're seeing the change agent turn to the institutional level, and what we're seeing is like 3 or 4 different ways that companies are stepping out and forward. The first is that they are becoming conveners of whole cities that they work in. So National Grid out of the UK and in the Northeast in the United States starts saying, we need to speed up this smart grids stuff. Let's take our advertising budgets, and that's kind of, you can't really make contact with communities that way, but let's bring whole communities together. So they use the Appreciative Inquiry Summit to bring cities, like 600 people into the room to plan the green visions of that city. Fairmont Minerals did the same thing in Cleveland, and it was called Building a Green City on a Blue Lake. And they created the funding and the capacity to bring like 700 citizens and residents and neighborhoods together with all the other businesses and so on. So that is just spreading. Walmart, for example, has this big project right now to take a gigaton of CO2 out of the supply chains, and they've got 220 partners. But again, they're using their capacity, and they realize that to get the job done, it can't be just internal facing. So they said to the dairy industry, let's convene the whole national dairy industry to set its objectives and its sights on net zero and lower toxicity and so on. So this idea of institutions as platforms for change. Patagonia, for example, has a platform where for all their communities, all their stakeholders, and they help them network and connect with about 30 different change efforts in society. So why are companies doing this? Another example, Harley Davidson, they're moving towards net zero and the stakeholder approach. And they're in a community in Milwaukee with, just that's very struggling economically and racially and all different kinds of ways. So they host and bring the whole community together.
It's collaboration instead of competition.
It's collaborative advantage. Yep. And instead of competitive advantage, it's competitive excellence, but collaborative advantage.
Mm-hmm. And that's so interesting, because you might say, aren't we up against human nature? And this is where I want to draw the example from the summit you hosted in Denmark back in 2007, David, for CSR professionals who joined us for the summit. The largest organizations in Denmark sent their CSR professionals there. And then there was this lady, after you spoke to the good in human being and the human soul, and there was this lady raising her hand and saying, no, I do not believe in any of this. Human beings are selfish and egocentric, and they're not going to give up their paycheck to do good in the world. So what's your response to this? Is that true?
Yeah, my response to this is that, there is some truth to the fact that we are in a period of time where we don't believe in our ability to come together. Our politics are fractured, and We have large, shattered beliefs. Can we really come together to make the breakthroughs in race and equity and inclusion and all those things? But at the same time, we have learned a lot about the foundational, things about the basic human nature. And if you create conditions that are that tap into that, it's really, really easy. The best in human beings, for example, comes out when you have every single level of a company in the same room, when you have the customers in the room, when you have all the external stakeholders and communities in the room. A lot of CEOs are nervous about bringing all that external voice together, but there's something in the human being that responds to wholeness. And the next step in that is in these kinds of multi-stakeholder planning dynamics, design sessions where you're really designing the future together. The other voice that's coming in now is, and this is a bigger leap in some of the companies I'm working with, but they say, how do we bring the voice of nature? How do we bring the voice of the species? How do we bring the voice of the earth into it? And they're actually creating ways to do that, where they'll assign a group of scientists and environmentalists and people who are really close to the earth, indigenous, and they will represent that stakeholder group. That's a shift that's happening that says we are not above nature. We're not, we are so interdependent, and this movement towards interbeing and the practical methods to do it. My sense of hope goes up every time we do something like this, because it's like it doesn't take much to scratch the surface and bring out the deepest and best in human beings.
And I guess it depends on the questions we ask, like you pointed out earlier, Roberta, right? So is it the same thing that has happened within journalism, you believe, or what's the stake of that right now?
Well, there have been some really strong movements in terms of something like the solutions journalism movement, SOJO. It actually was percolating for a number of years, but it's about, again, looking at not what's wrong, but where are the solutions based on facts, based on data, and then sharing it with other news organizations. And it's thriving. And then the same thing with, the fact that covering climate now, I think it began, I'm guessing that it was around 2018, 2019. And now that it's got hundreds of organizations that are signatories to a declaration that they're going to do a better job, more thorough job, and more focused job in terms of covering climate now. So those are really heartening to me. And, talking about, listening to you, David, I was thinking about how tribal we are too, as a species.
Yeah.
And so that as things kind of in this tipping point period that we're talking about, with young people really activated, motivated, galvanized to do something about climate so that they have a world to breathe in, that it is like a tipping point. It's the more people that are doing good in terms of corporate entities and citizen groups. I'm on the board of a group called One Earth, which is all about nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. And so, it has a focus also on indigenous leaders. I went to Panama a few months ago to look at a whole collaboratory that was happening with something called Geoversity, teaching young people, working with the Guna tribes there, and planting literally hundreds of thousands of trees, taking back land that has been clear cut for cattle and planting trees, and teaching about about nature and nature-based solutions to climate. So there's a lot of movements all over the world that I think, again, my stubborn belief in hopefulness is that this is the decade, because if it doesn't happen in this decade, it's a real doomsday scenario.
Yeah.
And I hate to say that, David, with you in the room, an appreciative inquiry, but I'm still focused on an appreciative future, that we will get.
It sounds like you are replacing one word with another, or one mind state with another. So instead of just thinking it's going to go away by itself, you say, well, let's go from competition to collaboration, or from individualism and egocentricism to wholeness. So is that, David, is that part of the appreciative inquiry philosophy as well, to have that image that you can actually put in people's minds so that they know what they are moving towards, rather than just what they're moving away from? So platform that you decide.
And that's why it is so much fun for these students Roberta talked about in the Aim to Flourish. They're sitting down with leaders all over the world and hearing these stories that are real, but just not, they're muffled, they're not heard. And, for example, this company, it's called Solar Foods, and they raised and this is part of the fun of it too, is the radical innovation that's possible when you start saying, how might we? And they said, how might we make food out of thin air and make natural protein 20,000 times more land efficient than it is today, while propelling a future where everyone on Earth can be handsomely fed using only a tiny fraction of its service. What they're raising is, can you eliminate agriculture and have and so they've set out to disconnect food production from agriculture. It's radical. And when the students hear this, the company again is called Solar Foods. You can look at it. When they hear these things, they start realizing that management and leadership in this new era it could be a noble profession. Another group did this study of, I think it's a company that makes shoes for young people, gym shoes, and it's called Nothing New. And there's nothing new on any part of the shoe. It's all from plastics that can be recovered and so on, and fishnets, and there is absolutely nothing new. And what's interesting from a business perspective is, when you're done with them, you send them back to the company, they send you $20. Well, companies are finding that this, moving towards this circularity, we used to call it efficiencies of scale. Now we're getting efficiencies of cycles. You move, and how many times? Why do they send you back $20 for that? Well, because they can use it over and over again. So the young people just, again, love these kinds of things. Currently, Toyota is building net positive cities. This one deeply woven city at the base of Mount Fuji, and they're creating cities that give back more clean energy to their surroundings than they use. They're leveraging exponential technologies to individualize medicine and health for every single person in the city. They're turning all waste to wealth. They're, the hydroponic farming, which is 99% more efficient than regular farming. So anyway.
And regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
Regenerative, I just want to put in a word for regenerative agriculture in terms of carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
That, it's being scaled up now in ways that need to happen in this decade.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's really good. And so I want to just respond one more thing in terms of this. What I think leaders are looking for is something, and we've just defined it as flourishing enterprise, but and I'll define that. It's about people being inspired every day and bringing their whole selves into the enterprise. It's about agility. It's about innovation popping up from every part of the company and outside. And it's about realizing remarkable relationship value with stakeholders and ultimately with a flourishing Earth. So I think every leader wants that. And the question is, how do we get there? And there are some theories that say we need to really work at the level of consciousness of the leaders And then if the consciousness, kind of the sense of unity of all of life, then they'll do better work with sustainability, and then inside the company, and then they'll do some good work outside. And what we realized is that that's one way it can happen, but the other way is just for a company to start doing good out there. Not just good, but do it as a whole community of the whole company. Bring the company together for 3 days to design all the impacts and ways that the core business can serve society. And what we're finding is that, as communities start putting their focus not on the inside of their company, but on the outside to help that flourish, all of a sudden there's a mirror flourishing effect. That, it's not just the out there that's coming to life, it's the in here in the company. And that's so much fun to see. I wish everybody could see that. Like,
David, there's actually a very concrete question here, because
yeah.
I'm sure people would love to be part of that. But what about, this is a question from the audience, how do you sell this to organizations if they're not ready for it, or they don't want to do it or something? What advice would you have for employees or leaders in a company, perhaps, where this would be a great approach, but it's not happening?
Yeah. I think, first of all, it does need to happen from a deeper place, and maybe they should talk to some of the other CEOs that are doing this work, like Lyle Clark at Clark Industries in Chicago. They were a very toxic mosquito company, and Lyle he came to one of our programs and saw and heard these stories from Aim to Flourish, and saw these companies that were alive. And I think deep down, a company that's doing that kind of toxic harm knows, deep down, everybody knows we're part of that. And that's depressing. And
David, I visited Lyle's place outside of Chicago, and I've never seen more smiling faces among his employees. I mean, people bound out of bed in the morning to come to work because they feel that they're in service to something. And so the results.
And Lyle's story is one of vulnerability. Like, he didn't know how the heck we're going to move in this sustainability plus direction. I mean, just the chemistry needed to be changed. Later, they did win the Green Chemistry Award from the president in the United States for no toxicity, no chemicals at all. Everything.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story.
So I think maybe one learning is that what you're actually pointing at, both of you, is to go find those stories where it has worked and where it is being applied, and then be inspired by what is it they did, because they started somewhere too. They were maybe up against a CEO or a company where there was no readiness for this, or they didn't want to do it. And we have the whole community force of what's happening in the world right now, helping us, aiding us in that travel. But we also have real life stories out there, it sounds like. And you gave some amazing resources today. We're going to share it afterwards with the audience, all the people you're pointing at, where to find more resources, how you can actually be inspired by those stories and bring them on into your own organizations. So we only have 7 more minutes left, and I wanted to give both of you a chance to wrap up your findings and your key points. And if there was anything you wanted to touch upon that we haven't touched upon yet, you have a chance now. So Roberta, why don't you start, and then I'll give the word to you, David, towards the end.
Well, I love the idea of storytelling as a way to get into people's hearts. I think it's part of, it's in our DNA really to sit around the campfire and tell stories. And so companies that do that well, the Patagonias and Univision and others, know how to inspire their employees and their community in terms of, it's like reciprocal, really. And I'd love to invite all of you out there to something that is happening this weekend. I'm on the board of something called the Peace Studio, which David came from Images and Voices of Hope. We collaborated and joined forces. Again, collaboration is sort of what makes me bound out of bed in the morning these days. And the Peace Studio is having a summit this weekend that's free. We have more than 100 speakers. And I'd like to invite everyone to that. Just go to the peacestudio.org website. And I really believe, I feel, well, that David Orr quote that I love, that is, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. We all need to have our sleeves rolled up to help each other so that we can have a flourishing planet. And I look to the students, 3,500 stories that they've created by interviewing business leaders who inspire them. As the anecdotal response that we get is that it makes them want to work in companies that are doing good and doing well, or create companies that are doing good and doing well. And so I feel like this is all a movement that is galvanizing the world. And so I feel very hopeful, really, and excited about what we can get done in this decade ahead.
Nice.
Yeah.
You, David?
I agree. And I think we're in a period of time, where we are entering into this mission kind of economy. And I just see the human element coming alive in ways I haven't seen before. When I did my interviews in a display center in the Netherlands at Tesla, the young person, I said, under the display center, what is it that you do here? And he said, my job is to help electrify the renewable energy age. And I said, well, wait, what is your work here on the display center? And he said, my job is to electrify the renewable energy age. And I said, what do you say to your mother about what your real job is? And he said, you don't get it. That is my job. My job is to electrify the renewable energy age. Anyway, that's what I'm seeing, like in these industries, and like Clark, the one we were just sharing, they transform the whole culture. And it's like this, if we want an empowered workforce, a fully alive workforce, where people are bringing their best selves to the workplace every day, don't look inside the company. Help everybody to collaborate to do something that makes a huge difference in the world and a better business at the same time. So I guess my three thoughts are, we call these positive institutions. They're bringing their strengths out there. And I think that's the most potent force on the planet for elevating the human flourishing on the inside. And when you imagine 200 millions of corporations circling the earth, more than that, you can start feeling that this moment in history, that we can really make systemic changes happen. A $90 trillion economy is a big force, obviously. And then finally, I do think we're at the end of one economic era and entering the other. Companies are either going to be seen as part of the problem or part of the solution revolution that's happening.
Right. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining today. I'm so excited that we had this discussion, and there's so much more to learn and so much more we could talk about. So I want to pull up a slide, just the last slide here, to pay attention to more on David, and more coming up. And I'll share the links for every source that Roberta shared with us as well. There's this global conference coming up, the 5th Global Forum on business as an agent for world benefit. And I must say, David, you started this revolution way back, and now finally it seems like it's getting attention worldwide. So I'm very optimistic and happy as well. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Pernilla.
And I hope.
Thank you, David.
Great to connect, Roberta and Pernilla.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Be well.